The ballroom at Ashwood Park had never looked so much like a stage set. Every chandelier blazed with 200 candles. Every mirror had been polished to a lacquer finish so precise it doubled the guests, doubling their jewels, doubling the particular angle of satisfaction with which Lady Constance Fairwood surveyed the room from the top of the staircase in her ivory silk gown and her mother's sapphires. The flowers had been arranged in 3 colors exactly: cream, blush, and a deep arterial red that the florist had described as romantic and the butler had privately found alarming. The musicians played without pause. The footmen moved in practiced arcs. 300 people had come to celebrate the 4th year of the Ashwood Investment Consortium, and they celebrated it thoroughly, in the way that people celebrate things they did not themselves build. She noticed, as she always noticed everything, that the cream roses on the east table had already begun to curl at the edges. And at the edge of all that calculated magnificence, standing behind the east table with a small pair of scissors in her right hand and a notebook pressed flat against her left forearm, was Margaret Hale. Not a guest. Margaret did not have the dress for it. She wore what she always wore at these events, a dark grey wool that she had had for 3 years and maintained with the kind of attention that made 3 years look like one. Her hair was up and pinned precisely. Her notebook contained the evening's full operational plan in 2 columns, what should happen, and what was actually happening. The column on the right had already acquired 4 notes in her close, unhurried handwriting. The cream roses on the east table needed trimming. The second footman had been placing glasses 1 inch too far to the right, which meant the servers were consistently reaching across guests. The tuning of the cello had gone slightly flat in the room's heat, which no one else had noticed but which would begin to irritate the guests' nerves without their understanding why. And the seating arrangement for the post-concert supper had a gap in it, because Lord Pemberton had sent his regrets at 4 o'clock that afternoon and no one had updated the card placement. She had fixed 3 of those 4 problems before 8 o'clock. She was working on the 4th. He arrived at 8:17. The Duke of Ashfield came through the main entrance without announcement, which was itself a kind of announcement. The room did not erupt. It adjusted, the way a room adjusts when something structural changes, like a door opened in a building that has been sealed, a new pressure from a new direction. People turned without quite deciding to turn. Conversations abbreviated themselves. Lady Constance Fairwood, who had been watching the entrance for 40 minutes with the focused patience of a woman who has planned her approach carefully, moved forward from the staircase with a smile that had been practiced into something that looked entirely natural. The Duke of Ashfield did not look at her immediately. He looked, instead, at the east table. Not at the flowers, exactly. At the woman beside the flowers, who had just replaced the last of the curling cream roses and was now making a notation in her notebook without looking up from the page. He looked at her for a moment with the particular stillness of a man who has just identified something he did not expect to find. Then Lady Constance was before him, and he turned, and the moment closed. Margaret did not see it. She had already gone to find the supper steward about the seating arrangement. She did not know that she had been noticed. She never did, in those days. That was, as she would understand much later, the precise nature of the problem. Margaret Hale had been managing Ashwood Park for 6 years. Not the grand display of it. Not the chandeliers and the flowers and the placement of the sapphires. She managed the part that made the display possible and then disappeared so thoroughly that the display seemed to arise from nothing, like music from a room with no musicians. She managed the accounts. She managed the creditors. She managed the 11 tenant farms that comprised the eastern portion of the Ashwood estate, and the 4 wool merchants who contracted against those farms, and the single long-standing arrangement with a cotton factor in Manchester whose ledger entries had never quite resolved correctly until Margaret had spent 4 consecutive evenings in January 1842 with a candle and a ruled notebook and found the error, a transposition of figures so small that it had been overlooked for 3 years. Extracting £92 annually from the Ashwood returns without anyone having noticed. She corrected it. She renegotiated the factor's contract at the next renewal to include a verification clause. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She had come to Ashwood Park 6 years earlier at 22, following the death of her father. Her father had been a clergyman in Helstone, a man of genuine learning and limited means who had given Margaret the run of his library before she was 10 and had never quite adjusted to the fact that she read everything in it and remembered most of it and had opinions, specific and organized opinions, that she expressed in full sentences. He had not known what to make of her, but he had loved her, which was the essential thing. When he died of a fever in the winter of 1837, he left her 200 books, a debt of £40 to the local chemist, and a letter of introduction to his distant cousin, Mr. Charles Hale of Harley Street, a man she had never met who held a position of some nominal authority over what remained of the family. Charles Hale had looked at her letter of introduction and said, not unkindly but with the decisive efficiency of a man who has just had a problem handed to him, that he knew precisely where she could be of use. He had a position, he said. Not a formal position. A kind of arrangement. The Ashwood Park household had recently lost their estate manager to gout, and the family solicitor, a Mr. Wicks, elderly and thorough, had been managing the accounts as a stopgap measure but found it somewhat more demanding than he'd anticipated. There was a good deal of organizational work to be done. There was a daughter of the house, Miss Eleanor Fairwood, who would benefit from a female companion and correspondent, though she was not, he emphasized, in need of a governess. There would be modest compensation. There would be a room. It was, he concluded, a practical arrangement. He said nothing about a title. He said nothing about credit. Margaret was 22 and had £40 of debt and no other prospects, and understood, with the clear-eyed practicality that her father's library had given her, that she was being offered a position that had no name because names carried obligations. She accepted it. She went to Ashwood Park in February of 1838. She was given a small room on the second floor. She was introduced to Mr. Wicks, who was indeed elderly and indeed thorough, and who handed her 4 years of estate accounts with a combination of relief and mild guilt that she found entirely readable. She was introduced to Miss Eleanor Fairwood, who was 17 and bored and clever, and who would become, over the following months, something genuine, a friend, a correspondent, the kind of company that made the long evenings workable. She was not introduced to the Duke of Ashfield, who was in London for the season and would be in London for the next 4 seasons, and whose estate she was managing. This was the arrangement. She had come to understand it completely within the first 3 months. She was to manage. She was not to be acknowledged. The accounts that she balanced and the creditor negotiations that she conducted and the 4 wool merchant contracts that she renegotiated over the first 2 years, producing an improvement in net annual returns of approximately £320, a figure she had calculated and entered in a supplementary ledger column and shown to no one. These were to be treated as the natural operation of the household. Not as her work. As the estate's work. As the way things were done at Ashwood. There had been a moment, in the spring of 1840, when she might have demanded otherwise. Mr. Wicks had retired. The family solicitor who replaced him, a younger man named Garvey, had arrived with a good deal of confidence and had looked at Margaret's accounts for approximately 4 minutes before explaining to her, in the corridor outside the estate office, that he would be taking a more active role in management going forward and that her assistance with the household ledgers was appreciated, but that the substantive estate decisions would now be made through him. She had stood in that corridor for a moment. She had looked at Mr. Garvey, who was 30 years old and believed himself to have correctly assessed the situation. She had said, very quietly, that she was glad he had found the accounts clear, and that she hoped he would find the supplementary ledger equally useful, and that the third entry in March of 1840 would require his attention as the wool factor's contract was due for renewal in 30 days and the standard renewal terms would cost the estate £48 over the contract period unless renegotiated with the adjustment she had drafted and attached at the back. Mr. Garvey had looked at her. He had gone away and come back the following morning and said, somewhat more carefully than before, that the renegotiation draft was very sound. She had renegotiated the contract. Mr. Garvey had communicated the terms. Neither of them discussed whose work it was. She picked up her notebook and continued. That was the decision she made in that corridor, and she made it without drama and without resignation. She was not going to become less than she was because no one was watching. She had learned from her father's library and from 6 months of managing accounts under conditions of complete institutional invisibility that competence does not require an audience to remain competence. The work was real regardless of who was credited for it. The £48 remained in the estate's accounts regardless of whether anyone knew she had saved them. She told herself this clearly, on a number of mornings, before breakfast. Most of the time she believed it. There was a moment, twice perhaps, when she pressed one hand briefly against the stone wall of the estate corridor and felt the cold of it and thought of her father's library and the late October evenings when he had called her in to discuss a passage and had listened, actually listened, to what she said about it. Those moments did not last long. She did not allow them to. She had work to do. It was Eleanor Fairwood, now Eleanor Marchmorn, married 3 years to a pleasant barrister from Shropshire and thoroughly happy, who had told her, in a letter the previous autumn, that the Duke of Ashfield had returned. Not just returned to London, but returned to Ashwood Park. To the estate itself. For the first time in 4 years. Eleanor's letter had been characteristically direct. He will be there for the autumn, and I am told through Mamma that he intends to take a proper interest in the estate management at last, which I imagine means he will look at several things you have already sorted and ask good questions and then leave again in 6 weeks. You will manage it perfectly and he will never know you did. Write to me when it becomes unbearable. Margaret had read that letter twice and then filed it in the small correspondence box she kept on the windowsill and returned to the accounts. She thought, briefly, about the years. 6 of them. 4 wool contracts renegotiated. 3 creditor disputes resolved without litigation. 1 tenant farm crisis, a failed harvest in the northeast quarter, autumn of 1841, managed over the course of 11 weeks with a revised rent schedule, a renegotiated seed supplier agreement, and the kind of careful arithmetic that had prevented 2 tenant families from eviction. 214 separate ledger corrections. A household running, at the end of 6 years, with a net efficiency she could express precisely, £412 annually recovered or preserved against the pre-1838 baseline. £412. She had never told anyone that number. She pressed her pen carefully to the page and continued with the current week's entries. The Duke had been standing outside the estate office door for approximately 7 minutes before Margaret noticed. This was unusual. She noticed most things. But she had been deep in the October accounts, a particular sequence of entries relating to the repairs on the North Barn, which a contractor had overbilled by £11 and 6 shillings, and which she was annotating in preparation for the correction, and she had simply not heard him. She heard him when he moved. A small sound, a shoe against the stone floor, and she looked up. He was standing in the doorway. He had not knocked. He was taller than she had imagined, which was a strange thing to notice first, but she noticed it. He wore a dark tailcoat with no ornamentation and the kind of precise, unadorned cravat that suggested a man who dressed to not be looked at rather than to be seen. He was perhaps 32. He had the particular quality of stillness, not ease, not relaxation, but containment, the stillness of a mechanism held at rest that she had come to associate, over years of reading faces, with people who had learned that expression cost something. He was looking at the ledger shelves. Not at her. At the shelves. At the particular orderly arrangement of 6 years' worth of account books in their annual progression, labelled in her handwriting. These are organized by year, he said. It was not a question. And within each year by quarter, Margaret said, and within each quarter by category: estate income, estate expenditure, household accounts, and a supplementary column for non-recurring items. There is also a cross-reference index on the left end of the shelf. He looked at the cross-reference index. Then he looked at her. You produced these. I maintain them. How long? 6 years, Your Grace. Something moved very briefly across his face, and then it settled again into its customary containment. He said nothing else immediately. He came fully into the room, he did not ask permission, but he moved as though he was aware that the room was hers and looked more closely at the nearest shelf. He drew out the 1840 volume, the one with the wool factor correction, and opened it at random. He read for 2 minutes in silence. She watched him read and thought, with the particular precision of someone who has learned to read rooms before she can read faces, he did not expect this. This entry, he said, and he turned the volume toward her to indicate a page. This annotation in the margin. What is the asterisk? It refers to the supplementary note at the back of the volume. The original contractor figure was incorrect. I identified the discrepancy and corrected it before the seasonal payment was made. The note at the back documents the original figure, the corrected figure, and the correspondence with the contractor. He turned to the back of the volume. He read the note. He turned back to the main entry. £92, he said. Per annum, for 3 years prior. The correction prevented a 4th year. He closed the volume and returned it to the shelf with a care she had not expected. He stood looking at the shelf for a moment. My solicitor Garvey handles estate communications, he said. He reports quarterly. I know. I prepare the materials he reports from. The Duke turned and looked at her. Not the measuring look from the ballroom, something more direct than that. Something with an edge to it. Does he know that you prepare them? We have an arrangement, Margaret said, and she heard, even as she said it, the precise weight of the words. There was a pause. It was the kind of pause she had learned not to fill. I see, the Duke said. He picked up his gloves from where he had set them on the edge of the desk without her noticing. She had not seen him set them down, which was the second time this morning she had failed to notice something he had done, which was unusual, and turned toward the door. He paused in the doorway without turning back. Miss Hale. Your Grace. The North Barn contractor. Overbilled by £11.06. I was annotating it when you arrived. The correction letter will go out this afternoon if you authorize it. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once, to the doorframe rather than to her, and left. She looked at the ledger on her desk for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and continued. She had managed crises before breakfast for 6 years. She could manage this. What she could not quite account for, in the days that followed, was the Duke's continued presence. She had expected the pattern Eleanor had described, a week's attention, a few questions, a departure. The pattern of a man fulfilling an obligation to an estate he owned but did not particularly inhabit. She had managed that pattern before, in a smaller way, with Garvey and with various other men who arrived with authority and left with her work credited to them. She knew how to navigate it. She had, in 6 years, become very good at being useful without requiring recognition. The Duke of Ashfield did not follow the pattern. He came back to the estate office 3 days after their first meeting, this time at the hour she usually worked in the mornings, which she had told no one and which she could only assume he had observed. He brought 2 questions about the 1841 harvest crisis, specific questions, the kind that required him to have read her annotations carefully. She answered them. He listened in the way that people listen when they are actually taking in information rather than waiting for their turn to speak, which she had found, over the years, to be a rarer quality than it should have been. He came back the following day. And the day after that. He did not bring Garvey. He did not explain why. Within the week, a pattern had established itself that she had not designed and could not entirely account for. He arrived at 9 in the morning. He brought a specific question about a specific entry or a specific contract or a specific tenant matter, always having read the relevant material first. They worked through it. Sometimes he asked her to explain her reasoning. She explained it. He asked further questions. These were not the questions of a man being polite or managing a subordinate. They were the questions of a man who was trying to understand something he believed was genuinely worth understanding. On the 5th morning he arrived and said, without preamble, the Thornton lease in the northeast quarter. Your revised rent schedule from 1841. Walk me through the arithmetic. She walked him through the arithmetic. All of it. 16 entries, 5 revised figures, 2 renegotiated terms, and the final calculation that had kept the Thornton family from eviction through a winter that had already been very cold. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did this alone." There was no one else, she said, and she meant it as a factual statement, and it was. He looked at her. There was that quality of stillness in him again, the held mechanism, but something behind it that she was beginning to learn to read. It was not pity. It was something more like recognition, the particular expression of a person who has just identified a fact that restructures other facts around it. She picked up her notebook and continued with the morning's work. He stayed for another hour. She learned, from Eleanor's correspondence and from certain things the housekeeper Mrs. Beale told her without being asked. Mrs. Beale was a woman of 62 who had been at Ashwood Park for 20 years, and who had made her opinion of the household's invisible arrangements known to Margaret within the first month. In the form of an extra candle delivered to the estate office without comment every evening, she learned that the Duke had been at Ashwood Park for the first time in 4 years. Because his father, the elder Ashfield, had sent a letter. Not a warm letter. A letter of the kind that fathers of a certain position and temperament write when they have decided that a situation has gone on long enough. The letter informed the Duke that he was 32 years old and that the Ashfield dukedom required an heir, and that the consortium investors who had supported the estate's expansion over the previous 8 years expected a family of the appropriate structure to be associated with the title they were investing in. The letter further informed him that Lady Constance Fairwood, whose family connection to the Ashwood estate went back 2 generations and whose credentials in every material respect were exactly suited to the match, had expressed, through appropriate channels, a willingness to receive his attention. The Duke had come to Ashwood Park to assess his estate and to fulfill his father's expectations. This was the shape of the situation. Margaret understood it clearly. She had understood it from the first night in the ballroom, from the way Lady Constance had moved forward and the way the room had adjusted and the way the Duke had turned and been received. She had placed them at adjacent seats in the supper arrangement without being asked, because it was the correct logistical decision, and she had felt nothing particular about making it. She was an arranger of seating. She was a fixer of overbilled contractors. She was a woman in a grey wool dress who maintained 6 years of accounts in orderly annual progression and had never asked for anything. She told herself very carefully on a Thursday morning in November while trimming the accounts for the week, precisely what she had always been. The library at Ashwood Park was on the east side of the house, where the light came in late and stayed long in the afternoon. It had not been used in any serious way for 4 years. The previous summer the housekeeper had opened it periodically for airing, and Margaret had used it twice in winter when the estate office became too cold, but otherwise it held its 37 years of accumulated volumes in patient, undisturbed order. She had been there for an hour on a wet Wednesday afternoon when the door opened. The Duke stood in the doorway again. He seemed to have a habit of doorways. He looked at her and at the books spread across the reading table and at the annotated page in her notebook, which she had been using to trace a discrepancy in the Fairwood-Ashwood property boundary records from 1809 that had surfaced in a tenant dispute and which no one had looked at carefully enough in 30 years. "I did not know anyone used this room," he said. "The light is better here in November. I hope I am not intruding. It is your room as much as any other." He said it without emphasis, as though it were a simple fact, and then seemed to register what he had said and set it aside. He came into the room. He did not ask what she was doing. He looked at the property records on the table with the same focused attention he brought to the ledger entries, reading upside down with the ease of someone accustomed to reading from awkward positions. "The Thornton boundary dispute," he said. "Partly. The boundary records from 1809 have an inconsistency with the 1823 survey. The discrepancy is small, 7 yards along the northeast line, but it is the basis of a current dispute between the Thornton lease and the Pembridge lease, and if it is not clarified it will require arbitration. I believe the 1809 records are correct and the 1823 survey contains an error. I have found 3 supporting references." She indicated the open volumes. He sat down, without asking, in the chair across the table. He pulled the 1809 property record toward him and read it. She went on working. It was, she would think later, a strange kind of peace. 2 people in a room of books and records, working through a problem, the rain against the east windows and the afternoon light going slowly golden and then grey. He asked questions at intervals. She answered them. He did not say things that weren't useful, which she had come to understand was not as common a quality as one might hope. At some point she looked up and found him watching her rather than the documents. He had the expression of a man about to say something he has not quite finished formulating. She waited. "How long have you known about the boundary discrepancy?" he said. 4 months. "Why has no one addressed it?" "I brought it to Mr. Garvey in July. He indicated he would look into it." She paused. "I believe it remained in his correspondence tray." He looked at the document in front of him and said nothing for a moment. "I will speak to Garvey. It would be helpful if the 1823 survey could be formally corrected before the spring planting. The Thornton family needs the clarity before they decide on the northeast field." He stood. He did not leave immediately. He stood looking at the shelves for a moment in the way he sometimes stood looking at things when he was not yet finished thinking. "Miss Hale," he said. "Your position here. What exactly is it titled?" She met his eyes directly. "It has no formal title, Your Grace." There was a pause. It was a different kind of pause from the ones they had learned to navigate in the estate office. "Something heavier in it." "I see," he said, which was what he said when he had registered something he found unacceptable and was deciding what to do about it. She picked up her pen. He left. But she noticed, as she heard his footsteps in the corridor, that they stopped for a moment just outside the door. The following morning she found, on her desk in the estate office, a single sheet of paper in the Duke's handwriting. It was a formal letter of authorization, not from Garvey, not from the household account, but from the ducal signature instructing the estate solicitor to formally correct the 1823 survey and resolve the Thornton-Pembridge boundary question according to the 1809 record, with Miss Margaret Hale named as the originating researcher of the resolution. Her name in the ducal letter. She sat with that for a moment. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the desk. Then she picked up her pen and added the letter to the current week's active correspondence file. She was not going to make more of it than it was. But she did not make less of it, either. Lady Constance Fairwood came on a Friday in the third week of November. She came with her mother and her mother's companion and 2 trunks of gowns, and she settled into the East guest suite with the ease of someone who has assessed the dimensions of a room and found them satisfactory. She was 26, dark-haired, classically beautiful in the way that classical beauty had always been available to women with the resources to frame it correctly. She had been prepared for this visit. She had opinions on the Ashwood dining room, which she expressed to Mrs. Beale within the first hour, and on the flower arrangements in the front hall, which she expressed to the footman who was unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity, and on the general arrangement of the household, which she expressed, over dinner that first evening, in a way that stopped just short of an explicit complaint. Margaret was not at the dinner. She had not been invited to the dinner, which was a distinction that required no particular interpretation. Mrs. Beale brought her a supper plate to the estate office at 8 o'clock with the expression of a woman who had thoughts she was not going to express in words. "Thank you, Mrs. Beale," Margaret said. Lady Constance inquired about the household accounts. Mrs. Beale said, setting the plate down. "I told her they were maintained centrally by the estate management." That was the correct answer. She asked who was responsible for the estate management. "What did you tell her?" Mrs. Beale looked at her steadily. "I told her it was a matter the Duke of Ashfield would be best placed to address." She paused. "He was in the room." Margaret looked at Mrs. Beale. "He said, Mrs. Beale continued, with the precision of someone reporting exact words, that the estate management was handled by Miss Hale, who had maintained the accounts for 6 years with results he considered entirely satisfactory. A pause. Lady Constance said that was very admirable. She said it the way people say things are admirable when they mean something else. Margaret returned to her supper. She did not say what she thought about the dinner, or about Lady Constance's inquiry, or about what the Duke had said. She thought about the boundary letter on her desk. She thought about the way he had sat across the library table and read upside down and asked questions that were actually worth answering. She thought about what she was doing and what she was allowing herself to think, and she put both of those things carefully aside and went back to the week's accounts. Lady Constance found her on Saturday morning. Margaret was in the garden, taking measurements along the south terrace wall where a section of stone had cracked and needed assessment before the winter set in. She was carrying a measuring tape and a notebook, which she suspected Lady Constance found incongruous with the terrace and possibly with the morning. "Miss Hale," Lady Constance said, coming across the gravel in a morning gown of pale blue and a wrap of extraordinary quality. "I wondered if I might find you here." "Good morning, Lady Constance. I hope I do not interrupt." "Not at all." Margaret made the last measurement and closed her notebook. She waited. Lady Constance looked at the wall. Then she looked at Margaret with a directness that Margaret appreciated, because it meant she was about to say the actual thing. "You have been at Ashwood Park for some years," Lady Constance said. 6. "You know the estate very well." "Reasonably well." "You know the Duke, also, I think." "Rather better than one might expect from a household arrangement." She said it pleasantly. It was not pleasant. Margaret looked at her. She said, very precisely, "I know his accounts. I know the estate he inherited and the condition it was in 6 years ago and the condition it is in now. I know the Thornton lease and the wool factor contract and the North Barn roof and the 1809 property survey. I have been doing those things, systematically, for 6 years, without a title or a formal commission or acknowledgement of any particular kind. That is what I know." Lady Constance was quiet for a moment. She had not expected that level of specificity. "I do not mean to be unkind," she said, after a pause, and Margaret thought she meant it, in the way that people mean things when they have just realized they have met someone they did not expect. "I know you don't," Margaret said. She picked up her measuring tape. "The south wall needs approximately 12 feet of repointing before January. I'll put the estimate in the week's maintenance notes." She paused. "Good morning, Lady Constance." She went back into the house. The Duke came to the estate office that afternoon. He arrived at 3, which was not his usual hour, and he had what Margaret would have described, in a ledger notation, as a slightly altered expression, not quite discomfort, not quite resolution, but the particular look of a man who has decided something and is working out how to communicate it without dramatizing it. He said, without preamble, "Garvey is leaving at the end of the month. I have decided to formalize the estate management arrangements." Margaret set down her pen. "I would like to commission you formally as estate manager," he said. "With the title, the commission, and the salary appropriate to the role. The figure I am proposing is £120 annually, which I understand is consistent with the responsibility." He paused. "It should have been done years ago. I am aware of that." She looked at him. "Your father's letter," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a question. "My father's letter has nothing to do with this." She held his gaze. He did not look away. "The consortium dinner," she said. "The investors who attended. Several of them have asked me operational questions about the estate over the last month. They are aware that the accounts are well managed. 2 of them know my name. Yes. They will wonder about the formal arrangement." "They can wonder about it," he said. "It does not affect the commission." She sat for a moment with the decision laid out in front of her the way she might sit with a set of accounts, looking at all the figures, not just the ones she wanted to see. It was £120. It was her name on a commission. It was 6 years of invisible work made visible. It was also a household in which Lady Constance Fairwood was currently resident, and a duke who had been sent to that household by a father with very specific expectations, and a social architecture that had very clear opinions about what a woman with no title and a grey wool dress and a measuring tape was entitled to. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." He nodded. He turned as though to leave. He stopped. "Miss Hale." He turned back. "Your cravat," she stopped herself. He was not wearing a cravat. He had removed his coat, she realized, because the estate office had been warm since she had repaired the flue in the corner fireplace, and he had come in his waistcoat, which he had never done before, and she had been so absorbed in the decision she had not noticed. She felt something very brief and entirely unauthorized pass across her face. He looked at her with the expression she had begun to recognize as the one he used when he was not going to let something go until he understood it. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I was going to say your cravat had been crooked since luncheon, but you are not wearing one." There was a pause. "I will keep that in mind," he said. And the corner of his mouth did something she had not seen it do before. He put on his coat and left. She sat for a moment. She straightened her spine. She picked up her pen and returned to the accounts. The consortium dinner was on the 14th of December. 11 investors, 3 of whom had been with the Ashwood Consortium since its founding, and 8 of whom had joined in the expansion years. They came from Manchester and Leeds and London and 1 from Edinburgh, men of capital and opinion who had been funding the Ashwood Estates development for 4 years on the expectation that it was a sound and well-managed investment. Margaret prepared the materials. She had always prepared the materials. She prepared them differently this time, not as notes for Garvey to report from, but as a full documented account, 3 years of returns in tabular form, annotated with the specific interventions that had driven each improvement, the margin changes and the contract renegotiations and the tenant adjustments and the boundary resolution and the 11 specific items that had been corrected, prevented, or improved since 1838. She prepared the cross-reference to the supplementary ledger. She prepared the projection for the following 3 years based on the same methodology. She did not know that the Duke had told his consortium, by letter 3 days earlier, that the estate management presentation at the December dinner would be made directly by Miss Margaret Hale, formerly commissioned estate manager of Ashwood Park, whose work had been the operational basis of the returns they had been receiving for 6 years. She found this out at 8 o'clock on the 14th of December when the Duke met her in the corridor outside the dining room, where she had been standing with her documents and her composed expression and the dark grey dress she had bought specifically for this occasion, not a ball gown, but a quality wool, cut well, the kind of dress that said "I am here on business and I am serious about it," and he said, "The investors are expecting you." She looked at him. "I sent them a letter," he said. "I described what you do and who has been doing it. I thought they should know before they heard it from you." A pause. "I also told my father." She absorbed that. The elder Ashfield. The man who had sent the letter about Lady Constance and heirs and appropriate social structure. What did he say? She said. He said it was unorthodox. A pause. He is coming in January to review the accounts himself. I told him he was welcome to. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her, steady and contained, with the expression she had come to understand meant, I have made the decision. I am holding it. She straightened her spine and picked up her documents and went into the dining room. The dining room at Ashwood Park held, at that hour, 11 men of capital and their collective skepticism, which she could feel in the room the way you feel a draught from a badly sealed window, present but manageable if you know where it is coming from. Lord Merton, who was the eldest investor and had the bearing of a man accustomed to being the most authoritative presence in any room, looked at her from the far end of the table with an expression that combined surprise and something she chose to read as interest rather than dismissal. She placed her documents at the head of the table. She did not perform certainty. She simply began. She presented 3 years of accounts in 18 minutes, moving from the summary table to the specific interventions, naming each one: the wool factor correction, the harvest crisis rent schedule, the boundary resolution, the contractor negotiations, the supplementary ledger methodology, and citing the specific figures for each. She showed, with the annotated projection, what those interventions were worth to the consortium going forward. She showed which contracts were due for renewal in 1843 and what the renegotiation strategy was for each. She answered questions when they arose. She answered them completely and precisely. When she finished, the dining room was quiet. Lord Merton, at the far end of the table, was looking at the summary table with an expression that had shifted considerably from where it had begun. Miss Hale, he said. You say this supplementary ledger methodology has been in place since 1839. Since the spring of 1839, yes. And it has been used as the basis for all quarterly reports to the consortium. Yes. And we have been receiving those reports through the estate solicitor. Through Mr. Garvey. I prepared the materials. He communicated them. Lord Merton looked at the Duke, who was standing to the left of the door in the particular position he had taken when she had entered, slightly apart from the seated investors, upright, watching the room with contained attention. A witness, not a participant. Your Grace, Lord Merton said, I would like to say that this presentation represents the clearest accounting of estate returns I have received in 30 years of consortium investment. He looked back at Margaret. I would further like to say that I find the prior arrangement, by which this work was communicated without attribution, to be a situation that does not reflect well on anyone's management of it. He said it without accusation, which somehow made it more pointed. No, the Duke said. It does not. We will want Miss Hale's commission formally registered with the consortium, Lord Merton said. And her name on the quarterly reports going forward. That is already arranged, the Duke said. She stood at the head of the table and felt, for the first time in 6 years, the precise sensation of being in the correct position. Not elevated. Not rewarded. Correctly placed. The way a figure in a ledger is correctly placed in its proper column, where it always should have been. She did not say anything. She gathered her documents with care and pressed them flat. She heard, from behind her as the investors began to speak among themselves, the sound of the Duke's footsteps crossing the room. Not toward the investors. Toward her. He stopped beside her. He said, in a voice pitched for her and not the room, You were brilliant. She looked at him. I was accurate. Yes, he said. That is what I meant. She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing very close, which was unusual, and he had the expression she had first seen in the library, the one that meant he was not going to stop thinking about something until he had resolved it. Miss Hale, he said. I should like to speak with you privately. When you are ready. She gathered the last of her documents. She aligned them carefully. I will be ready in a quarter of an hour, she said. He nodded and returned to the room. She went out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her documents pressed against her chest and her spine very straight. She looked at the corridor ceiling. She thought about 6 years of accounts. She thought about her father's library and the winter evenings and being listened to. She was not going to step aside for anyone. After a moment she returned to the estate office, set her documents in their proper place, and waited. He found her there, 15 minutes later. He came in without a coat again, which she had decided was a reliable indicator of his actual state of mind, a kind of informal flag, and he did not stand in the doorway this time. He came fully into the room and stood across the desk. "I should like to say something," he said. "And I ask you to hear it completely before you respond." "Yes. I came to Ashwood Park in October with my father's expectations in one hand and an obligation I had been avoiding for 4 years in the other. I came prepared to spend 6 weeks examining what my family had built and then proceeding with an arrangement that made structural sense to everyone who was watching." He paused. "I am not proceeding with that arrangement." She waited. "I have spent 8 weeks in this estate office," he said, "and in that library, and in the garden, and in the dining room tonight, in the company of someone I have found to be the most genuinely competent and most entirely honest person I have encountered in 32 years of encounters. And I am aware that that is not a particularly romantic declaration." Something moved across his face, brief and unguarded. "I am aware that you have been here for 6 years without being seen properly, and that I was the person who should have been seeing you and was not, and that I am now asking for something from you when I have not, until October, offered anything of equivalent weight in return." She stood very still. "I am asking," he said, "not because it is structurally convenient, not because it is what my father's letter and the consortium investors and the social logic of my position suggest I should want. I am asking because you corrected my contractor and you found my boundary discrepancy and you saved my tenant family in the winter of 1841 when no one asked you to, and because you told me your cravat had been crooked for 40 minutes and then apologized for it, and because I have spent 8 weeks becoming unable to imagine this estate, or any room I am trying to think clearly in, without you in it." He stopped. "That is the whole of it." Margaret looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at a set of accounts that she was verifying for the second time, not because she doubted the figures but because the numbers were significant and she wanted to be certain she had them right. She thought about it completely. She thought about Lady Constance, who was not evil but was the system made flesh, and about the elder Lord Ashfield arriving in January, and about what it meant to say yes to something that would make her visible in a way that being invisible had never required her to be prepared for. She thought about her father's library. She thought about the specific quality of the afternoons in this estate office over the last 8 weeks, the questions that were worth answering and the silences that were workable and the way he had returned the 1840 ledger volume to the shelf with care. She thought about £412 annually preserved. "Yes," she said. He stood still for a moment. She had the impression he had prepared himself for a longer answer. "Yes," he said. "Entirely." "Entirely," she said. She saw, for the first time, what he looked like when the held mechanism let go. It was not dramatic. It was just open. Like a room with the windows finally dealt with correctly, the light coming in at the right angle, everything as it should be. "There is one condition," she said. He waited. "My name goes on the quarterly reports permanently, not as a matter of the current commission but as a matter of policy. If I am running this estate, the investors should know who is running it and the documentation should reflect it." "Done," he said immediately. She nodded. She picked up her pen from the desk. She set it back down. She allowed herself, briefly and specifically, to feel what she felt. Lord Ashfield arrived on the 12th of January. He was 64, upright, dressed with the austere precision of a man who had been a duke's father for 32 years and had understood the weight of that position to carry certain requirements. He had clear grey eyes and his son's quality of containment, though in the elder man it had a different texture, less held, more settled, the difference between a bridge under stress and a bridge that has simply been there a long time. He arrived, he reviewed the accounts, and he said nothing for the first hour. Margaret had been present by the Duke's direct invitation, not as a background figure but at the desk, with the full ledger set open before her and the consortium report alongside it. The elder Lord Ashfield had looked at her when she entered the room with an expression she had identified accurately as the patriarchal gait, the specific opposition that is not cruel and is not personal but is structural in the way that walls are structural, built by people who believed in the purpose of walls. He reviewed the accounts for an hour and a quarter. He reviewed the projection. He reviewed the cross-reference index. He read the boundary resolution letter and the wool factor contract and the harvest crisis rent schedule. He was thorough. She respected his thoroughness. Then he looked up and said, to the room in general and to his son in particular, "This is £412 annually above the 1837 baseline." "Yes," the Duke said. "Produced through 7 specific operational interventions over 6 years." Yes. And attributed in no formal documentation prior to October of this year. No. Lord Ashfield set the ledger down with the particular deliberateness of a man who is not entirely comfortable with what he is about to say. He looked at Margaret. He looked at her the way he might look at a thing he had assessed incorrectly and was now reassessing, without warmth but without contempt, the look of a man engaged in honest revision. "Miss Hale," he said, "you have managed this estate with more technical competence than the last 3 men I employed to do so." A pause. "I find the prior arrangement, the attribution arrangement, to be one I cannot defend, reviewed from this vantage." Another pause. "I do not say I have no reservations. I have reservations. I will not pretend otherwise." He turned to his son. "But I am not blind to what is in front of me." He picked up his gloves from the desk. "I will tell you," he said to Margaret, still without warmth, but with a new and careful precision, that the estate could not have been better served. He put on his gloves. "That is not an uncomplicated thing for me to say. I am saying it." He went out. Margaret looked at the accounts in front of her. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the desk. Then she picked up her pen. The Duke was watching her from the doorway. She met his eyes. "He will come around," he said. "He already has," she said. "Partially." She looked at the ledger. "It is enough. They married in March. Not a grand occasion. Margaret had no use for grand occasions that she was not managing, and the Duke had never required an audience for things he meant. 16 witnesses. Eleanor Marchmorn, who had come up from Shropshire with her husband and had stood in the entrance hall of Ashwood Park on the morning of the ceremony and taken Margaret's hands and looked at her with 8 years of friendship in her face and said, "I always knew," which was both slightly inaccurate and entirely welcome. Mrs. Beale, who produced a wedding breakfast of extraordinary quality and refused to accept that this was anything other than entirely appropriate. Mr. Edward Wicks, who had retired to Henley and had nonetheless made the journey with his walking stick and a letter of congratulation he had written in December upon hearing the news, because he had known, he wrote, since the spring of 1838 what sort of person had taken up residence in the Ashwood estate office, and he was only glad that someone else with the appropriate authority to act on it had eventually come to the same conclusion. Lord Ashfield attended. He sat in the second row. He did not smile. He was present, and his presence was not neutral, and Margaret understood the weight of it. Lord Merton attended. He had written to the consortium in January to formally register his support of the match in terms that made clear he was speaking in his capacity as lead investor and that his reasoning was entirely fiduciary, which Margaret had found both transparent and somewhat endearing. They stood before the minister in the small chapel on the Ashwood grounds, the one whose records Margaret had reviewed 4 times in the course of various estate matters and whose minister she had helped with a heating arrangement the previous winter, and the ceremony was brief and unremarkable and entirely real. She wore ivory, which was not grey, and she noted this without particular drama. He had given her his mother's ring, a small square-cut sapphire in a plain gold setting, the night before, in the estate office, which was precisely where she would have chosen to be given it. He had placed it in her palm and closed her fingers over it and stood for a moment with his hands around hers, and that was the whole of the declaration, and it was sufficient. Thomas Ashfield was born on the 14th of November 1843, in the room that had been the elder Duke's study and that Margaret had, with characteristic efficiency, converted to a nursery in the 6 weeks prior, having identified it as the most practically suited room for the purpose and having arranged the conversion with a contractor whose billing she checked with the same attention she brought to everything. He had his father's eyes, grey and measuring, and his mother's particular quality of watchfulness, the quality of a person who is taking in more information than they appear to be taking in. He had also, from approximately his 7th month, a tendency to pick up any object left within his reach and subject it to a focused inspection that Margaret recognized and his father found quietly extraordinary. She continued the accounts. She had, by March of 1844, formalized the supplementary ledger methodology into a documented system that she shared, at Lord Merton's request, with 3 other consortium estates whose managers had requested access to it. By 1845 it was in use in 7 households. She did not call it a system, formally. She called it a working record. Other people called it the Hale method, which she found somewhat theatrical but did not object to. The boundary resolution that she had spent 4 months on in 1842 became, after a minor amendment to the survey process, the standard approach used in 3 adjacent county estates for resolving historical survey discrepancies. She wrote a short document describing the methodology. Mr. Wicks read it from Henley and wrote back that it was the clearest piece of legal reasoning he had encountered that had not been produced by a solicitor. She filed his letter in the correspondence box on the windowsill. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1845, Margaret Ashfield sat in the estate office with the current quarter's accounts spread across the desk and Thomas in his small chair beside the window, absorbed in the systematic investigation of a wooden spoon. The light came in from the east, the long late light of a Sunday, and the room was warm because the flue had never given trouble since she'd had it repaired in November 1842. She heard her husband's footsteps in the corridor. She knew his footsteps. She knew the particular rhythm of them that meant he was not going anywhere in particular, that he was simply moving through the house. They stopped outside the estate office door. She did not look up. She went on with the accounts. After a moment the door opened and he came in, without a coat, which meant exactly what it always meant, and he stood in the room and looked at her and at Thomas and at the accounts on the desk and the light through the windows. He did not say anything. He simply leaned against the doorframe in the way he leaned when he had no obligation to be anywhere else, and he watched her. She made 2 more entries. She blotted the page. She set down the pen. She looked up at him, and found exactly what she had learned to find there, that specific quality of attention that was not like anything she had encountered in the years before him. Not admiration. Not management. Something more particular than either. The attention of someone who has found the person they needed to find and does not intend to look away. She had asked for nothing, in all the years she had been here. She had worked and managed and preserved and solved and arranged and annotated, and she had asked for nothing because there had been no one to ask and because she had decided, in a corridor with her hand against the stone, that she was not going to become less than she was. She picked up her pen once more and set it properly to the page. Thomas dropped his wooden spoon on the floor and regarded it with philosophical interest. Her husband crossed the room, picked up the spoon, returned it to the small reaching hand, and straightened up beside her desk. He stood looking down at the accounts with the expression she recognized as genuine interest, because he had always been, from the very first morning in the doorway, someone who found the actual work worth looking at. The light fell across the page. The afternoon was warm and unhurried. The accounts were in order. Margaret Ashfield went on.